A desperate child's voice. A flooded neighborhood. A CEO who answers the wrong call at the right time. When 7-year-old Violet makes an emergency call with 3 infant sisters trapped in a refrigerator, she doesn't reach 911. She reaches millionaire business mogul Richard Hastings. What unfolds is a race against rising waters, a mother's anguish, and an unexpected connection that will transform 5 lives forever. Can strangers become family when fate demands it? Will love bloom in the aftermath of disaster? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and type Amen in the comments. A beautiful piece of good news may come your way very soon, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days in the modest neighborhood of Riverside Commons, but nobody expected what came next. 7-year-old Violet Monroe pressed her small face against the cracked window of their ground-floor apartment, watching the street transform into a churning river. Her 3 baby sisters, 10-month-old identical triplets in matching onesies, babbled in their playpen behind her, oblivious to the danger creeping under their door. "Mama will be home soon," Violet whispered to herself, repeating the words like a prayer. Her mother, Charlotte Monroe, worked double shifts at the diner downtown, always promising she'd be back before dark. But dark had come early today, brought by clouds so heavy they seemed to press against the earth itself. The water was ankle-deep inside now. Violet's heart hammered as she splashed toward her sisters. The triplets, Daisy, Poppy, and Rose, looked up at her with identical blue eyes, still smiling despite the cold water soaking their blankets. At 7 years old, Violet had learned to be the second mother in this house, the one who changed diapers when Mama was too exhausted, who heated bottles at midnight, who sang lullabies in a voice still learning its own strength. But she'd never learned what to do when the world turned into an ocean. The front door burst open with a violent crack. Water poured in like a living thing, hungry and unstoppable. Violet screamed as the current knocked her backward, her thin body no match for nature's fury. She grabbed the edge of the playpen, pulled herself up, and yanked one baby into her arms, then another, then the third. Her muscles screamed in protest. Each triplet weighed nearly 20 pounds, and Violet herself barely tipped the scale at 50. "Think, think, think," she muttered through chattering teeth. The water was knee-deep now, rising with terrifying speed. The apartment was flooding fast, and she couldn't carry all 3 babies at once. She couldn't swim. The door was blocked by the current. The windows were too high for a child to reach. Then she saw it, their old refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen, its door hanging open like a mouth. The appliance had stopped working months ago. They couldn't afford to fix it, and Mama said they'd haul it away when money came. Until then, it sat empty. Nothing inside but air and broken dreams. Empty. Floating. Big enough. Violet didn't think. She acted. She waded through water now reaching her waist, dragging all 3 screaming babies with superhuman strength born of pure terror. The refrigerator bobbed slightly in the rising flood, its white surface gleaming under the single flickering light bulb still clinging to power. Violet yanked the door wider and gently placed Daisy inside, then Poppy, then Rose. They fit perfectly. 3 little bundles in their pink, purple, and yellow onesies, their cries echoing in the hollow chamber. "Shh, shh, you're safe now," Violet cooed, though her own voice cracked with fear. Stay here, please stay here." She wedged the door partially shut. Not closed, never closed, because she'd heard about children suffocating in old refrigerators, but secure enough that the babies wouldn't tumble out as the water lifted the appliance. The fridge began to float, bobbing like a strange lifeboat in the middle of their drowning home. Violet's mind raced. She needed help, real help, adult help. Mama's phone. Where was Mama's phone? She spotted it on the kitchen counter, the water just beginning to lap at its edges. In seconds, it would be completely submerged. Violet lunged forward, her small hands scrambling across the slippery counter surface, water splashing her face as she stretched on her tiptoes. Her fingers closed around the device just as a wave pushed it toward the edge. Please work, please work, please work. She pressed the power button with trembling fingers, water dripping from the case that Mama always kept on it, one of those thick rubber ones that had saved the phone from Violet's own accidents before. The screen flickered once, twice, then blazed to life, cracked but functional. Violet had watched Mama make calls 1,000 times. She knew about 911. She knew about emergencies. With water now chest-deep and rising, with her baby sisters floating in a broken refrigerator, with her mother somewhere out in this nightmare, Violet dialed. But in her panic, her small, wet fingers slipped. Instead of 911, she hit recent calls. Instead of emergency services, she called the last number Mama had dialed, a number from 3 days ago, when Mama had applied for a better job at some big company downtown, a job she never got a call back for. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Across the city, in the top-floor corner office of Hastings Industries, Richard Hastings stared at his phone with irritation. He'd been CEO of his tech empire for 15 years, building it from a garage startup to a billion-dollar corporation. At 46, with silver-streaked hair and a beard that made him look distinguished, he commanded respect in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. He was powerful. He was wealthy. He was completely, utterly alone. His phone showed an unknown number, probably another telemarketer, another waste of his Saturday evening when he should be reviewing quarterly reports. He almost didn't answer. But Richard Hastings had built his fortune on a simple principle. Every call matters. Every connection counts. In a world of algorithms and automation, he'd instructed his AI phone system to route unknown calls directly to him on weekends, a test of new emergency response software his company was developing. If the system worked, it could save lives. If it didn't, well, he'd only wasted a few seconds. He picked up. Hastings Industries, Richard speaking. The voice that came through nearly stopped his heart. Daddy? It was small, terrified, breaking on every syllable. Daddy, my sisters and I are in the flood. The water is coming and I put them in the fridge and I don't know what to do and Mama isn't here and please, please help us. Richard stood so fast his leather chair crashed backward. Wait, who is this? Where are you? I'm Violet, the child sobbed. I'm 7 and my sisters are babies and they're floating and I'm scared and... Her voice disappeared into static as the phone crackled and died. Violet! Richard shouted into dead air. Violet, can you hear me? Nothing. The call had dropped. But he'd heard enough. A child, babies, a flood, and she'd called him Daddy. Richard's mind spun. He had no children. He'd never married, never found the right woman, never made time for anything except building his empire. But that little girl's voice, that desperate plea, that word, Daddy, it carved into something deep inside his chest, someplace he didn't know still existed. He grabbed his coat and sprinted for the door, his phone already pulling up weather alerts. The news made his blood run cold. Catastrophic flooding in Riverside Commons, a low-income neighborhood on the east side. Emergency services overwhelmed, roads impassable, evacuations underway but chaotic and incomplete. Riverside Commons, where desperate mothers worked double shifts, where old refrigerators stayed because hauling them cost money nobody had, where a 7-year-old girl was alone with 3 babies in a flood. Richard had the system trace the call. The number led to a Charlotte Monroe, address 247 Riverside Commons, apartment 1B. He was already in his car, a sleek black Range Rover built for any terrain, when the rational part of his brain tried to intervene. This wasn't his problem. This wasn't his child. He should call the authorities and let them handle it. But that voice, Daddy, my sisters and I are in the flood. No child should sound that terrified. No child should be that alone. Richard Hastings had built an empire on being ruthless, efficient, emotionless. But in that moment, listening to the echo of a little girl's desperate plea, something cracked in the armor he'd worn for decades. He pressed the accelerator and drove toward the flood like a man possessed, not knowing he was racing toward the moment that would change his entire life, and not knowing that in the drowning darkness of Riverside Commons, a beautiful, desperate mother was also racing through rising waters, screaming the names of 4 daughters she thought she might never see again. The storm raged on. The water kept rising. And in apartment 1B, Violet Monroe clung to a floating refrigerator and whispered prayers to a god she hoped was listening, while 3 baby sisters slept inside their strange ark, dreaming innocent dreams while while the world drowned around them. The water had reached Violet's shoulders when she heard the first sounds of rescue, but they weren't the sirens she'd hoped for. They were the desperate, raw screams of a mother who'd just arrived home to find her entire world submerged. "Violet! Daisy! Poppy! Rose!" Charlotte Monroe's voice cut through the storm like a knife through silk. She'd run 7 blocks through waist-deep water after the bus stopped running, had abandoned her shoes somewhere in the 3rd block, had scraped her knees bloody climbing over a fallen tree in the 5th. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back in a neat ponytail for her diner shift, hung in wet ropes around a face twisted with primal terror. The door to apartment 1B was completely underwater now. Charlotte dove without hesitation, her lungs burning as she swam through the submerged doorway into what used to be her home. She surfaced inside, gasping, and immediately saw the refrigerator bobbing in the center of the room like some kind of surreal boat. And clinging to it, barely keeping her head above water, was Violet. "Mama!" Violet's scream was relief and terror combined. "Mama, they're inside. They're safe. I put them inside." Charlotte didn't understand, not immediately. Her brain couldn't process why her eldest daughter was talking about inside when referencing a floating refrigerator. Then Violet pulled the door open wider, and Charlotte saw them. 3 tiny faces, 3 pairs of blue eyes, 3 little bodies tucked safely in the hollow chamber of their broken appliance, dry and confused but very much alive. The sound that came from Charlotte's throat wasn't quite human. It was something between a sob and a prayer, a release of tension so profound it nearly knocked her underwater again. She swam to the fridge, wrapped her arms around all 4 of her daughters at once, and held them like she could merge them back into her own body, make them part of her again where they'd be safe forever. "How did you—" Charlotte couldn't finish, couldn't find words big enough for what her 7-year-old had just done. "It was always empty, Mama," Violet said simply, her small voice steady now that her mother was here. "Even without leftovers. So I thought it could be like a boat." Charlotte kissed her eldest daughter's forehead, tasting rainwater and tears. "You brilliant, beautiful, amazing girl, you saved them. You saved your sisters." But their moment of relief shattered as the water surged higher. A window exploded inward from the pressure, glass shrapnelling across the surface of the flood. The current grew stronger, spinning the refrigerator in a slow, sickening circle. Charlotte grabbed it with both hands, using her body to shield her daughters from debris floating past, pieces of furniture, clothing, a child's toy boat that had become grimly ironic. "We have to get out," Charlotte gasped. "We have to get to higher ground." But where? The apartment complex had no second floor. The water was too strong to fight. And Charlotte was exhausted, her muscles screaming from the run here, her body operating on nothing but maternal adrenaline and the last dregs of a double shift. That's when they heard it. The rumble of an engine that had no business operating in these conditions. Headlights cut through the rain-soaked darkness, impossibly bright, impossibly close. Richard Hastings had driven his Range Rover as far as physics would allow, then abandoned it when the water reached his wheel wells. He'd waded the last 3 blocks, his expensive suit ruined, his Italian leather shoes destroyed, his carefully maintained appearance completely obliterated by mud and rain. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was a little girl's voice saying, "Daddy," and the address burning in his mind. 247 Riverside Commons, 1B. He'd brought rope, emergency flares, a waterproof flashlight, the kind of equipment his survival-obsessed assistant always insisted he keep in his vehicle, equipment he'd mocked as paranoid excess until exactly this moment. "Violet!" he shouted into the darkness. "Violet Monroe!" Inside the apartment, Violet's head snapped up. "That's him, Mama!" "That's the man I called." Charlotte's exhausted brain struggled to make sense of this. "What man?" "Violet. Who did you call?" "I tried to call 911, but I hit the wrong number, and a man answered and I called him Daddy because I was scared and—" "Violet!" The voice came again, closer now, accompanied by splashing footsteps. Charlotte made a decision in a split second. She didn't know who this man was, didn't know why her daughter had his number, didn't know anything except that help had arrived and her babies needed saving. "We're here!" Charlotte screamed with everything she had left. We're in apartment 1B, 4 children and 1 adult. Richard followed the sound of her voice like a beacon. He crashed through the submerged doorway and surfaced inside the apartment, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam landed on a scene he'd never forget. A young woman, maybe 27 or 28, with blonde hair plastered to a face that was somehow both exhausted and ethereally beautiful, holding onto a floating refrigerator that contained, he counted quickly, 1, 2, 3, 4 children. His brain, trained to assess situations in milliseconds, cataloged everything. The woman's protective stance, the older girl's relieved expression, the 3 tiny faces peering out from inside the appliance with identical features that marked them clearly as triplets. "I'm Richard Hastings," he said, keeping his voice steady and calm despite his racing heart. "Violet called me. I'm here to get you out." Charlotte's blue-green eyes met his, and something passed between them in that moment. Not romance, not attraction, nothing so simple. It was recognition. The acknowledgement that they were 2 adults in an impossible situation, responsible for 4 innocent lives, and they would do whatever it took. "Charlotte Monroe," she said, her voice hoarse. "These are my daughters. Can you really get us out?" Richard was already moving, uncoiling the rope he'd brought, tying it around the refrigerator with efficient knots learned from a sailing hobby he'd picked up years ago. "I have a vehicle 3 blocks north on higher ground. The water's strong but manageable if we stay together. We'll use the fridge as a flotation device for the triplets." "You want us to pull them in a floating refrigerator through a flood?" Charlotte's voice held a note of hysteria. "Your daughter already thought of it," Richard said, meeting Violet's eyes with something like respect. "She saved their lives with quick thinking. We're just going to finish what she started." Violet straightened slightly, pride mixing with fear on her small face. Richard continued, his CEO voice taking command without arrogance. "Charlotte, you'll hold Violet. I'll pull the fridge. We move together, we stay calm, we don't panic. The current is strong, but not impossible. 3 blocks, we can do 3 blocks." Charlotte wanted to argue, wanted to say this was insane, wanted to demand why this stranger was here, how Violet had his number, what any of this meant. But the water was still rising, and her daughters were running out of time. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, 3 blocks." Richard secured the rope around his waist, then around the refrigerator, creating a tether that wouldn't break. He helped Charlotte position Violet on her back, the 7-year-old's thin arms wrapped around her mother's neck. Then he checked the triplets one more time, making sure they were secure inside their strange vessel. "Ready?" he asked. Charlotte nodded, though nothing about this was ready. They pushed through the submerged doorway together, back into the flooded street that had become a river. The current immediately tried to pull them apart, but Richard's rope held firm. He pulled the refrigerator with steady, powerful strokes, his body trained from years of morning swims in his penthouse pool. Charlotte kicked beside him, her exhausted legs finding strength she didn't know existed. Violet clung to her mother's back, her face pressed against Charlotte's shoulder, her eyes squeezed shut as she whispered, counting numbers like a mantra. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The triplets somehow impossibly began to cry in unison. Not from fear, but from hunger, from cold, from the general confusion of being 10-month-olds in a completely incomprehensible situation. "It's okay, babies," Charlotte gasped between strokes. "Mama's here. Mama's got you." But it was Richard who was pulling them through the flood, his muscles burning, his breath coming in controlled gasps, his mind focused on one single goal. 3 blocks. Just 3 blocks. They passed submerged cars, floating furniture, a child's bicycle tangled in a tree branch. The disaster was everywhere, but Richard kept his eyes forward, kept pulling, kept moving. 2 blocks, 1 block. Then they saw it. Richard's Range Rover. Exactly where he'd left it, water lapping at its doors, but the interior still dry. Higher ground, solid ground, safe ground. Richard hauled the refrigerator onto the concrete with the last of his strength, then helped Charlotte drag Violet up beside it. Together, they pulled the triplets free from their makeshift ark, 3 wet, crying, beautiful babies who just survived the impossible. Charlotte collapsed onto the concrete, all 4 daughters in her arms, sobbing with relief so profound it shook her entire body. Violet wrapped her small arms around her mother and sisters, creating a cocoon of family, of survival, of love. Richard stood nearby, water streaming from his ruined suit, and watched them. 5 people he didn't know. 5 lives he just helped save. And when Charlotte looked up at him with eyes full of tears and gratitude and something deeper, he felt something shift in his carefully controlled world. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you doesn't even start to cover it, but thank you." Richard knelt down beside them, and for the first time in 15 years of ruthless business dealings, his voice cracked with genuine emotion. "Violet called me daddy when she was scared. I've never been anyone's daddy. But in that moment, I couldn't not come." Charlotte's breath caught. Violet looked between her mother and this strange man who'd appeared like a miracle, and in her child's wisdom, she said exactly what everyone was thinking, but nobody dared to say. "Maybe you could be our daddy for real." The question hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect, as the storm finally began to ease and the first responders' sirens started to wail in the distance. Richard met Charlotte's eyes across 4 shivering little girls, and neither of them looked away. The emergency shelter was chaos wrapped in bureaucracy and tied with exhaustion. Richard had driven them there in his Range Rover, the triplets crying in Charlotte's lap. Violet pressed against the window, watching her world transform into a disaster zone. The Red Cross had set up operations in the high school gymnasium, with rows of cots and tables piled with donated clothing and volunteers serving hot soup from industrial-sized containers. Charlotte stood in the registration line with her daughters, trying to answer questions from a well-meaning volunteer who kept asking for documentation she didn't have. Insurance cards that were underwater in her apartment, birth certificates that were pulp by now, identification that was probably floating somewhere in Riverside Commons. She felt like a ghost of herself, a woman made of exhaustion and gratitude and fear. Richard hadn't left. He stood slightly apart, his soaked business suit making him absurdly out of place among the refugees in their donated sweats and borrowed blankets. He'd made phone calls, quiet conversations in corners where Charlotte couldn't quite hear. His assistant, his lawyer, his accountant, people who could make things happen with a single instruction. "Ma'am, without proper ID, we can't process emergency funds," the volunteer was saying apologetically. "Maybe if you have a relative who can verify." "I'll handle it." Richard's voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. He approached with a checkbook, an actual physical checkbook, because men like Richard Hastings still existed in a world where paper meant something, and wrote a number that made the volunteer's eyes widen. "Mr. Hastings, that's really not necessary," Charlotte began. "You need clothes. The babies need formula, diapers, everything. Your apartment is destroyed. You have no documentation." Richard's voice was calm, factual, the CEO analyzing a problem and implementing a solution. "Consider this a loan if it makes you feel better, but right now, your daughters need care." Charlotte wanted to argue. Wanted to maintain her pride, her independence, the fierce self-reliance that had kept her going through 2 years of single motherhood after her husband's death. But Violet was shivering in wet clothes, and the triplets needed changing, and she was so tired she could barely stand. "Alone," she agreed quietly. "I'll pay you back. We'll discuss terms later." Richard handed the check to the volunteer. "Get them whatever they need." Over the next hour, Richard watched as Charlotte transformed into a mother in survival mode. She bathed her daughters in a makeshift shower station, dressed them in donated clothes that didn't quite fit, fed the triplets bottles of formula while Violet ate a sandwich with the desperate hunger of a child who'd been too scared to think about food. She moved with efficient grace, this young mother who'd somehow survived catastrophe with 4 children and was already planning her next steps. Richard found himself mesmerized. In his world of boardrooms and stock options, he'd met countless strong people, but strength had always meant something different. Aggressive negotiations, hostile takeovers, zero-sum games where someone had to lose. Charlotte's strength was different. It was quiet. It was about making sure 4 little girls felt safe in a gymnasium full of strangers. It was about smiling when she had every reason to cry. It was about standing upright when collapse would have been completely justified. "You're staring." Charlotte's voice startled him. She'd materialized beside him, Poppy, or was it Rose, sleeping against her shoulder. It's unnerving. Sorry, Richard said, not sounding particularly sorry. I'm trying to understand how you're doing this. Doing what, surviving? Charlotte's laugh was hollow. What choice do I have? My daughters need me to be okay, so I'm okay. That's not okay. That's extraordinary. Something flickered across Charlotte's face. Pain, maybe, or recognition that someone saw past her performance. She sat down on a nearby cot, careful not to wake the sleeping triplet. Richard sat beside her, maintaining respectful distance. Violet says you built a big company, Charlotte said after a moment. She heard your assistant talking on the phone. Hastings Industries, tech solutions mostly, government contracts, emergency response systems. Richard paused. Actually, the reason Violet's call reached me was because we're testing a new emergency routing protocol. It's supposed to connect desperate calls to qualified responders when traditional 911 is overwhelmed. Did it work? You're alive. So yes, I'd say it worked. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She called you Daddy. Violet. When she was scared, she called a stranger Daddy. Why did she do that? Richard asked gently. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, watching Violet across the gym, helping a volunteer distribute blankets to other children. Their father died 2 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver. Violet was 5. The triplets weren't even born yet. I was 6 months pregnant. Her voice was flat, reciting facts like a grocery list because that was the only way to say them without breaking. She barely remembers him now, barely remembers what it's like to have a daddy. Richard felt something crack in his chest, that same feeling from when he'd first heard Violet's voice on the phone. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't pay rent. Sorry doesn't buy formula for 3 babies on a diner waitress salary. Sorry doesn't... Charlotte stopped herself, shook her head. I'm sorry. That's not fair. You just saved our lives. I have no right to... You have every right, Richard interrupted quietly. You have every right to be angry at a world that took your husband and left you alone with 4 children and no support. Charlotte looked at him then, really looked at him. This man in his ruined, expensive suit, with his silver-streaked hair and his careful control, who'd driven into a flood to save strangers and was now sitting on a cot in an emergency shelter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Why did you really come? She asked. You could have called emergency services. Could have stayed dry and safe in your fancy office. Why did you drive into a flood for a child you'd never met? Richard considered his answer carefully. When I was 8 years old, my father left. Just walked out one day, said he was done being a family man, done with responsibility. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I grew up watching her destroy herself trying to be 2 parents, and I swore I'd never be like him, never abandon people who needed me. He met Charlotte's eyes. When Violet called me Daddy, even by accident, I couldn't be the man who didn't answer. The gymnasium noise faded away as they sat there. 2 people who'd been strangers hours ago, now connected by something neither quite understood. Charlotte shifted Poppy. Definitely Poppy. Richard was starting to recognize the slight difference in the triplets' faces, to her other shoulder. I don't know what happens next, Charlotte admitted. My apartment is destroyed. I have 4 daughters and no home. My job at the diner might not even exist anymore if the flooding hit downtown. I've been hanging on by my fingernails for 2 years, and now you don't hang on alone. The words came out before Richard could stop them, before his rational CEO brain could veto his irrational heart. I have resources, space, the ability to help. Charlotte stiffened. I don't need charity. Not charity, partnership. Richard's mind was already racing, already solving problems like they were business challenges. You need a place to stay. I have a home with empty rooms. You need employment. I have a company with positions that pay actual living wages. Your daughters need stability. I can provide that. Why? Charlotte's voice was sharp with suspicion. Why would you do this? You don't know us. What do you get out of it? Richard was silent for a long moment, watching Violet help a smaller child reach a box of crackers. her natural compassion shining through despite her own trauma. Honestly, I don't know. But I know that 3 hours ago, a 7-year-old girl saved her sisters with quick thinking and courage. I know her mother has worked herself to exhaustion trying to give them a good life, and I know that I have the means to help and no reason not to. People don't just help for no reason, Charlotte said bitterly. Not in my experience. Then let's call it an experiment. Richard turned to face her fully. I have a 3-month sabbatical starting next week. My board insisted I take time off, said I was working myself to death. I was planning to spend it alone in my apartment, probably working anyway. Instead, let me spend it helping your family get back on your feet. 3 months. A loan, an investment, whatever terminology makes you comfortable. At the end, you decide if you want to continue the arrangement or strike out on your own with resources to do so. Charlotte studied his face, looking for the angle, for the catch, for the inevitable strings attached. And what do you want in return? Richard smiled sadly. To not be the man who walked away. Before Charlotte could respond, Violet appeared beside them, her small face serious. Mama, the babies need changing and the volunteer says we can have a cot in the family section, but there's only one, and I don't know how we'll all fit. Richard stood. I have a better idea. I have a car outside with working heat. We can drive to my home, get everyone settled properly. You can make decisions about the future tomorrow. Charlotte wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her boundaries, her pride, her fierce independence. But she looked at Violet's exhausted face and heard Rose starting to fuss from across the gym, and felt Poppy's cold little body against her shoulder, and she made the same calculation she'd been making for 2 years. Her daughters came first. Always. Even if it meant accepting help from a stranger. One night, she said firmly. We'll stay one night and tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent. Richard nodded, knowing that one night would turn into more, knowing that Charlotte knew it too but needed the fiction of temporariness to maintain her dignity. One night. My car is outside. They gathered the triplets, collected the donated supplies the volunteers had assembled, and walked out of the chaos into the clearing night. The rain had stopped. The stars were beginning to emerge, and as Richard opened the door of his Range Rover for this makeshift family, he felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years of ruthless success. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something that actually mattered. Charlotte settled into the passenger seat, Violet and the triplets secured in the back. Richard had made a single phone call, and emergency car seats had appeared within minutes. The kind of casual display of power that would have seemed ostentatious if it weren't so desperately needed. As they drove through the disaster zone toward whatever came next, Charlotte glanced at this stranger who'd become their unlikely savior. Why did you really answer her call? She asked quietly. Richard kept his eyes on the road. Because nobody answered mine when I was 8 years old and my father walked away. Because I've spent 46 years building an empire, and I've never once felt as important as I did pulling a floating refrigerator through a flood. Because Violet called me Daddy, and for one perfect moment, I understood what I've been missing my entire life. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Charlotte reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. Thank you for answering. Richard squeezed back, then returned his hand to the wheel, but something had shifted. Something had begun. In the back seat, Violet watched the city lights blur past the window and held her sleeping sisters close. And in her child's heart, she knew with perfect certainty that the man driving them through the night was going to be important. She didn't know how yet, didn't understand the complexity of what was unfolding. But she'd saved her sisters with a refrigerator and called a stranger for help, and miraculously, impossibly, he'd come. If that wasn't magic, Violet didn't know what was. Richard's penthouse apartment occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Hastings Tower in downtown Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city that looked like a painting. Charlotte stepped through the private elevator doors carrying Daisy, with Violet holding her hand and Richard behind them with Poppy and Rose, and felt like she'd walked into another dimension. The space was massive, modern, and utterly masculine, all steel and glass and dark leather, with abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than Charlotte had earned in her entire lifetime. It was beautiful. It was intimidating. It was completely, utterly wrong for four little girls who needed warmth and softness and home. I know it's not exactly child-friendly, Richard said, reading her expression with uncomfortable accuracy. I've never had children here. Never had anyone here, really, except business associates. Charlotte set Daisy down carefully on the pristine white sofa, watching the 10-month-old immediately grab a designer throw pillow with sticky fingers. She waited for Richard to flinch, to protest, to reveal the inevitable irritation of a wealthy man whose perfect space was being invaded by messy reality. Instead, Richard knelt down beside Daisy and gently retrieved the pillow, replacing it with a soft blanket from a closet. Here, princess. This is better for you. Princess. The word was so natural, so unconscious, that Charlotte felt something twist in her chest. Violet had already discovered the windows, her small face pressed against the glass as she looked out at the glittering city 42 floors below. Mama, look. You can see everything. You can see the whole world. Not quite the whole world, Richard said with a small smile. But close enough. The triplets, released from their car seats and given freedom to explore, immediately began crawling across the expensive hardwood floors, leaving trails of formula and baby drool in their wake. Rose pulled herself up on the coffee table, glass and chrome probably worth thousands, and knocked over a sculptural centerpiece that Richard caught before it shattered. I should get them contained, Charlotte said quickly, her voice tight with embarrassment. They're going to destroy everything. They're babies, Richard said simply. Babies explore. Things are just things. He set the sculpture safely on a high shelf, then turned to survey his apartment with new eyes. Although I'm realizing this place is essentially a death trap for small children. Sharp corners everywhere, breakable objects at every turn. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice taking on that CEO efficiency Charlotte was starting to recognize. Jessica, I need you to arrange something. Emergency childproofing for my apartment. Corner guards, outlet covers, safety gates, everything. And furniture, cribs, changing tables, actual beds. Yes, tonight. I don't care what it costs or who you have to wake up. 4 children, ages 10 months, 3 of them, and 7 years. Female. Yes, all girls. He paused. And toys. Children need toys, right? Age appropriate. Educational but fun. You have nieces, you know this better than I do. Just make it happen. He ended the call and turned to find Charlotte staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? You just ordered someone to childproof a penthouse apartment at 11 o'clock at night? Charlotte said slowly. And they said yes. I pay Jessica very well to make impossible things possible. Richard shrugged. She'll have a team here within the hour. This is insane, Charlotte whispered. This whole thing is insane. 6 hours ago, I was serving coffee at a diner. Now I'm standing in a penthouse with a man I don't know, accepting help I can't repay, letting my daughters destroy an apartment that probably costs more per month than I make in a year. Richard crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid, grounding. Charlotte, look at me. She did, reluctantly. You survived a flood. You kept 4 children alive through circumstances that would have broken most people. You're not accepting charity. You're accepting a temporary solution to an impossible situation. There's no shame in that. There's always shame when you can't do it alone, Charlotte said bitterly. Trust me, I've had 2 years to learn that lesson. Before Richard could respond, Violet's voice cut through the tension. Mr. Hastings, can I ask you something? Richard turned to the 7-year-old, grateful for the interruption. Of course, and please call me Richard. Violet considered this seriously. Okay, Richard, why don't you have a family? You have this big house and all this space and you're all alone. Don't you get lonely? The question landed like a physical blow. Richard was silent for a long moment, aware of Charlotte's eyes on him, aware that his answer mattered more than it should. I suppose I do get lonely sometimes, but I've always been too busy building my company to think about building a family. That's sad, Violet said with the brutal honesty of childhood. Work is important, but family is more important. That's what Mama always says. Your Mama is very wise, Richard said softly. She is, Violet agreed. And you saved us, so I think maybe you could be part of our family now, if you want. We have room for a daddy. The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte looked like she wanted the floor to open and swallow her. Richard looked like he'd been offered something precious and terrifying and completely impossible. "Violet, honey," Charlotte began, her voice strained. "That's not how families work. You can't just adopt random people because they helped you." "Why not?" Violet's logic was unassailable. "You always said family is people who love you and take care of you. Richard came into a flood to save us. That sounds like love to me." Richard knelt down to Violet's level, his expensive suit still damp and ruined, his carefully controlled CEO persona completely shattered. "Violet, I would be honored to be part of your family in whatever way your mama is comfortable with. But these things take time. They're complicated. Grown-ups always say things are complicated when they're really just scared," Violet observed. Richard laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him. "You're right. We are scared. Change is scary, even when it's good change." "Were you scared in the flood?" Violet asked. "Terrified," Richard admitted. "But I came anyway." "Then maybe you should be scared of being our family but do it anyway," Violet said with 7-year-old wisdom that cut straight to the truth. The doorbell chimed before anyone could respond, the elevator opening directly into the penthouse because, of course, Richard Hastings didn't have normal hallways or doors like regular people. A team of 5 people emerged, led by a sharp-looking woman in her 30s who could only be the legendary Jessica. "Mr. Hastings," she said briskly, surveying the scene with quick efficiency. "I've brought everything on your list. My team will have this place child-proofed within 90 minutes. I've also taken the liberty of ordering food appropriate for young children and formula in 3 different brands in case the babies have preferences." She glanced at Charlotte with professional courtesy. "Ma'am, I've included clothing in multiple sizes for all ages, toiletries and basics. Everything is in the spare bedrooms. If there's anything specific you need, please let me know." Charlotte was too overwhelmed to speak. Jessica's team was already moving through the apartment like a well-oiled machine, installing safety gates, covering outlets, padding corners. One woman was setting up 3 portable cribs in one bedroom. Another was assembling a bed frame for Violet in an adjoining room. "Jessica," Richard said quietly. "Thank you. Just doing my job, sir." Jessica's expression softened slightly. "Although I'll admit this is the most interesting emergency request I've received in 15 years. Over the next 2 hours, Richard's sterile bachelor penthouse transformed into something that vaguely resembled a home for small children. The transformation was imperfect. Designer furniture doesn't suddenly become cozy just because you add safety padding. But it was functional. The triplets had cribs. Violet had a bed. Charlotte had a guest room with an actual door that locked, a bathroom with a soaking tub, and privacy she hadn't experienced in 2 years. By 1 in the morning, all 4 girls were finally, miraculously asleep. Charlotte stood in the hallway between their rooms, listening to the sound of her daughter's breathing, and felt tears streaming down her face that she couldn't quite explain. Richard found her there, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. He offered her one silently. "I don't know how to do this," Charlotte whispered. "I don't know how to accept help. I don't know how to trust a stranger. I don't know how to—" Her voice broke. "You don't have to know," Richard said quietly. "You just have to rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. Tonight you're safe. Your daughters are safe. That's enough." Charlotte sipped the tea, letting the warmth spread through her exhausted body. "Why are you doing this? Really? Not the PR answer? Not the noble explanation? What do you actually get out of helping us?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring into his own mug like it held answers. "When I was building my company, I told myself success meant never needing anyone. Independence meant strength. But standing in my apartment tonight, watching your daughters bring life into a space that's been dead for years, I realized something." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I've spent 15 years building an empire, and I have absolutely no one to share it with, no family, no real friends, just employees and business associates and people who want something from me." "And we don't want something from you?" Charlotte's laugh was hollow. "We're literally homeless refugees you pulled out of a flood. You didn't ask for my help. You didn't manipulate or scheme or calculate. Violet called a wrong number in genuine terror, and you—" Richard gestured helplessly. You're suspicious of every kindness because you've learned the world doesn't give without taking. That's honest. That's real. That's something I haven't experienced in longer than I can remember. Charlotte was silent, processing his words. You're lonely. Profoundly, Richard admitted. And I didn't even realize it until a 7-year-old asked why I don't have a family. They stood in the hallway, two broken people from completely different worlds connected by circumstance and catastrophe and something neither quite understood yet. The city lights filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in soft gold. 3 months, Charlotte said finally. Your offer. 3 months to get back on our feet. I accept, but with conditions. Name them. I work. I don't care what job, but I earn my keep. I'm not a charity case. Charlotte's voice was firm. I pay rent, even if it's nominal. I contribute. The girls and I don't just take up space in your life like decorative refugees. Agreed, Richard said immediately. I'll have Jessica draft a formal employment contract tomorrow. Fair wages, clear expectations, everything legal and proper. And boundaries, Charlotte continued. You're being incredibly generous, but you're still a stranger. We sleep in separate rooms. We maintain appropriate distance. Whatever Violet thinks she sees happening here, we're not... She stumbled over the words. We're not playing house. This isn't some romantic fairy tale. Something flickered across Richard's face. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. Boundaries, absolutely. You're a guest and an employee, nothing more. I understand. But even as he said it, both of them knew the boundaries were already blurring. You don't pull someone's children through a flood and maintain emotional distance. You don't open your home to strangers and keep your heart locked away. The lines were already crossed, they were just pretending otherwise. Tomorrow, Charlotte said, exhaustion finally overwhelming her adrenaline. Tomorrow we'll figure out contracts and employment and all the practical details. Tonight I just need to sleep. Your room is the second door on the left, Richard said. Everything you need should be there. If it's not, just ask. Charlotte started toward her room, then paused. Richard? Yes? Thank you. I know I keep saying it, and I know it's inadequate. But thank you for answering Violet's call. Thank you for coming. Thank you for this. She gestured at the transformed apartment. You didn't have to, and you did anyway. That matters. Richard watched her disappear into the guest room, heard the door click shut, and stood alone in his hallway that didn't feel quite so empty anymore. He should go to bed. Should sleep off the adrenaline and exhaustion. Should let his rational mind reassert control over whatever madness had possessed him to bring a family of strangers into his carefully controlled life. Instead, he walked quietly to the room where Violet slept, watched her small chest rise and fall with peaceful dreams, and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for calling me Daddy, little one. Thank you for giving me a reason to answer." Across the hall, Charlotte lay awake in luxury sheets, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, and wondered what she'd just agreed to. 3 months with a stranger, 3 months of borrowed safety, 3 months to rebuild a life from the wreckage of disaster. 3 months that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. The morning sun woke Charlotte with cruel brightness, filtered through windows that covered an entire wall, and offered no mercy for exhausted mothers who'd survived floods and strange rescues. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. This wasn't her cramped bedroom in Riverside Commons, wasn't the emergency shelter, wasn't anywhere that made sense. Then memory crashed back. The flood, Richard, the penthouse, her daughters sleeping safely in rooms down the hall. Charlotte sat up slowly, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache. Muscles punished by swimming through floodwater while carrying children. The guest room was decorated in shades of gray and cream, expensive and soulless, clearly designed by someone who prioritized aesthetics over comfort. But the bed was soft, the room was warm, and through the door she could hear blessed silence, which meant her daughters were still sleeping. She checked the time on the nightstand clock, 6:47 a.m. Less than 5 hours of sleep, but Charlotte had been operating on less for 2 years. She'd learned to function on exhaustion the way other people learned to function on coffee. The bathroom attached to her guest room was obscene, marble and chrome, a shower with 6 different settings, a soaking tub that could fit 3 people. Charlotte showered quickly, using expensive soaps that smelled like cedar and bergamot, trying not to calculate how much each bottle probably cost. She dressed in the clothes Jessica had provided, jeans that fit perfectly, a soft blue sweater, undergarments that were brand new and exactly her size. Everything fit, everything matched. It was both thoughtful and deeply unsettling that a stranger's assistant knew her measurements after a single glance. Charlotte found Richard in the kitchen, a massive chef's kitchen with appliances that looked like they'd never been used and enough counter space to feed an army. He was attempting to make breakfast, judging by the eggs scattered across the granite countertop and the pan smoking slightly on the stove. "I don't actually cook," Richard admitted without turning around. "I have a meal service that delivers prepared food, but children need breakfast and I thought—" He gestured helplessly at the chaos. Despite everything, Charlotte smiled. "You saved 4 people from a flood, but you can't make scrambled eggs?" "Different skill sets," Richard said defensively. "Emergency rescue I can do. Domestic tasks, not so much." Charlotte moved past him, turning down the heat on the stove and salvaging what she could from his culinary disaster. "Go sit down. I'll handle breakfast." "This is your home now, you don't have to—" "It's not my home," Charlotte interrupted firmly. "It's your home that you're generously letting us stay in temporarily. There's a difference. And I told you last night, I work for my keep. Making breakfast for my daughters and the man who saved them is the least I can do." Richard retreated to the island counter, watching as Charlotte moved through his kitchen with efficient competence. She'd clearly cooked in worse conditions. The diner, probably, where she'd worked double shifts for wages that barely covered rent. Within 10 minutes, she'd produced actual scrambled eggs, toast, and sliced fruit arranged on plates that Richard hadn't even known he owned. "That's impressive," Richard said honestly. "That's survival," Charlotte corrected. "You learn to cook fast and efficiently when you have 4 mouths to feed and 10 minutes to do it." They ate in comfortable silence until the patter of small feet announced Violet's arrival. The 7-year-old appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing dinosaur pajamas that Jessica had somehow procured, her hair a blonde tangle around her sleep-creased face. "Mama?" Violet's voice was small, uncertain. "I woke up and didn't know where I was and I got scared." Charlotte was on her feet immediately, gathering her daughter into her arms. "I'm here, baby. We're at Richard's home, remember? We're safe." "The flood," Violet whispered. "I dreamed about the water and the babies in the fridge and—" "Shh, it's over. Everyone's safe. Your sisters are still sleeping. You were so brave, Violet. So brave." Richard watched this small moment of maternal comfort, this intimate reassurance, and felt like an intruder in his own kitchen. This was what family looked like. The messy, unglamorous, essential work of making children feel secure. He'd never experienced it as a child, never provided it as an adult, never even considered what he was missing. Until now. Violet pulled back from her mother's embrace and looked at Richard with serious eyes. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you going to make us leave? When Mama finds a new place and gets money, are you going to make us go away?" The question punched the air from Richard's lungs. Charlotte tensed, clearly preparing to intervene, to explain about temporary arrangements and appropriate boundaries. Richard knelt down to Violet's level, his expensive suit creasing against the hardwood floor. "Violet, listen to me very carefully. I am never, ever going to make you leave if you don't want to go. If your mama decides she wants to find her own place, I will help her do that and I'll make sure you're taken care of. But you're not being kicked out. Not now, not ever. That's a promise." "What if Mama wants to stay?" Violet asked with the directness only children possess. "What if we like it here and you like having us and nobody wants to leave?" Richard glanced up at Charlotte, who looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her. "Then we'd figure out what that looks like, together, as a family." The word hung in the air, family, more terrifying and more essential than any business deal Richard had ever negotiated. The moment shattered as the triplets began crying in unison, their synchronized wailing echoing through the penthouse like an alarm system. Charlotte was already moving, but Richard stood up and gently caught her arm. "Let me," he said. "I need to learn this eventually, right?" Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. Richard walked down the hall to the nursery, When had he started thinking of it as a nursery instead of the spare bedroom? And opened the door to find 3 identical faces red and screaming from their cribs. He'd faced hostile board meetings, aggressive competitors, billion-dollar negotiations. But 3 crying babies were somehow more intimidating than all of it combined. Okay, Richard said to himself. Babies. You're just tiny humans with needs. I can figure out tiny humans. Daisy was closest, so he lifted her first, carefully like she might break, his large hands awkward around her small body. She stopped crying immediately, staring up at him with huge blue eyes that seemed to see straight through his CEO armor to the uncertain man underneath. Hello, Princess, Richard whispered. I'm Richard, I'm trying to figure out how to help you. He set Daisy carefully on the changing table, attempting to remember the mechanics of diaper changing from YouTube videos he'd secretly watched at 3 a.m. the previous night. It was messier and more complicated than the video suggested, but he managed. 1 diaper, 1 baby, 0 catastrophes. By the time Charlotte appeared in the doorway, Richard had changed all 3 triplets and was sitting on the floor with them, letting them crawl across his legs and grab his beard, and generally treat him like an expensive jungle gym. Charlotte leaned against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Richard said simply. Besides, if I'm going to be part of your lives for the next 3 months, I should probably learn the basics of baby care. They really like you, Charlotte observed. Babies are usually cautious with strangers. Maybe I'm not a stranger anymore, Richard said, catching Rose as she attempted to climb up his chest. Maybe after you pull someone through a flood, you stop being strangers and become something else. Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but her phone, now dried out and miraculously functional, buzzed with incoming messages. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. What is it? Richard asked immediately. Messages from the diner, from my landlord, from... Charlotte's voice shook. From everyone. The diner is closed indefinitely because of flood damage. My landlord says the entire building is condemned. I have 30 days to remove belongings, except there's nothing to remove because everything's destroyed. My bank account is overdrawn because my last paycheck bounced. She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I have 4 daughters, no job, no home, no savings, and I'm standing in a penthouse wearing clothes a stranger bought me, completely dependent on charity. This is the nightmare I've been fighting against for 2 years, and it finally caught me. Richard stood carefully, settling all 3 babies on a blanket before crossing to Charlotte. It's not charity, it's an employment opportunity. Remember our agreement? Employment doing what? Charlotte's laugh was slightly hysterical. I'm a diner waitress with no high school diploma and 4 children. What possible job could I do for a tech CEO that would justify the expense you're incurring? Richard had thought about this extensively during his sleepless night. My household staff is practically non-existent because I've never needed one. I eat delivered meals, have a cleaning service that comes weekly, handle my own basic needs. But now I have 4 children in my home who need structure, routine, proper care. I need a household manager. Someone to organize meals, coordinate schedules, manage domestic operations. That's a real job with a real salary. A household manager? Charlotte repeated flatly. That's a fancy term for nanny. It's a fancy term for an essential position that requires skills I don't possess, Richard corrected. Childcare, household operations, logistical coordination. Those are marketable skills. The fact that you're managing your own children doesn't make the job less legitimate. Charlotte wanted to argue, wanted to find the flaw in his logic, wanted to reject the solution that felt too easy and too perfect. But she thought about Violet listening to this conversation, learning what resilience looked like. She thought about the triplets who needed stability and routine. She thought about her own exhaustion, her own desperate situation, her own lack of options. What's the salary? She asked quietly, hating that she needed to ask. Richard named a figure that made Charlotte's knees weak. It was more than she'd made in 6 months at the diner. It was enough to save money, to build a future, to maybe even go back to school eventually. That's too much, she whispered. It's market rate for the position in Manhattan, Richard said firmly. Jessica researched it. Everything will be documented, legal, proper. You'll have a contract, benefits, everything. Benefits? Charlotte's voice cracked. Health insurance, retirement contributions, paid time off. Richard ticked items off on his fingers like they were obvious, universal. Not luxuries Charlotte had stopped dreaming about years ago. Standard employment package. Charlotte stood in the nursery of a penthouse apartment surrounded by 3 babies who were now happily playing with Richard's discarded tie, and made a decision that terrified her. Okay, 3 months. I'll try the position for 3 months and then we reassess. 3 months, Richard agreed. But they both knew 3 months could become forever if neither of them was brave enough to end it. What neither of them saw was Violet, standing just outside the nursery door, listening to every word with her small hand pressed against her heart. She'd heard adults make promises before. Her father promising to come home before the accident, landlords promising repairs that never came, Mama promising things would get better someday. But Richard's voice was different. When he made promises, he sounded like someone who kept them. Violet smiled to herself and went back to the kitchen to finish her breakfast, confident in the way only 7-year-olds can be that everything was going to work out exactly right. She was half right. Everything would work out. But first, the past would catch up with secrets that threatened to destroy the fragile family beginning to form in the penthouse above the city. Because 2 weeks later, when Charlotte was finally beginning to believe in stability, a woman would appear at Richard's door claiming to be his ex-fiancée and carrying news that would shatter everything they were building. 14 days. That's how long they had before everything almost fell apart. 14 days of establishing routines, Charlotte making breakfast while Richard attempted to help and mostly got in the way. Violet starting online classes from the dining table, her schoolwork spread across expensive wood that had never been used for anything so ordinary. The triplets learning to crawl faster, to laugh louder, to recognize Richard's voice and reach for him when he came home from brief office visits. 14 days of careful boundaries that gradually, inevitably blurred. Richard's hand on Charlotte's shoulder as she bent over a crying baby at 2 a.m., his touch lingering just a moment too long. Charlotte's laugh at Richard's terrible jokes, genuine and unguarded. Violet calling him Richard Dad when she thought no one was listening. The triplet saying da in response to his voice, though Charlotte pretended not to notice. 14 days of something precious and terrifying growing between them, something neither dared name. And then Victoria Ashford appeared. She arrived on a Tuesday morning announced by the doorman with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Hastings, there's a Ms. Ashford here to see you. She says it's urgent." Richard's face went white. Charlotte, feeding Rose in the kitchen, noticed immediately. "Who's Victoria Ashford?" "Someone from my past," Richard said carefully. "Someone I thought I'd never see again." He went to the private elevator and Charlotte watched a woman emerge who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Mid-30s, immaculately dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than Charlotte's yearly salary at the diner. Dark hair, sharp features, calculating eyes that swept the penthouse with obvious disdain. "Richard," Victoria said, her voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I see you've made some interesting life changes since I left." "Victoria." Richard's voice was carefully neutral. "What do you want?" Victoria's eyes landed on Charlotte, still holding Rose, wearing casual jeans and a sweater, clearly belonging in this domestic scene. "I want to talk to you, privately, about us." "There is no us," Richard said firmly. "There hasn't been an us for 3 years." 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days since I left, Victoria corrected. "Since you chose your company over our relationship. Since you made it clear that nothing mattered more than Hastings Industries." Her gaze flicked to Charlotte again. "Though I see you've found time for a family now. How convenient." Charlotte felt something cold settle in her stomach. This woman was Richard's ex, not just any ex, but someone who clearly had unfinished business. Someone who looked at Charlotte like she was an obstacle to be removed. "Violet," Charlotte called quietly. "Take your sisters to the playroom, please." Violet appeared instantly, her young face worried but obedient. She gathered the triplets with practiced efficiency, casting a long look at Victoria that was surprisingly hostile for a 7-year-old, then disappeared down the hall. "Smart," Victoria observed once the children were gone. Teaching them to make themselves scarce when adults are talking. Very domestic of you. Victoria, why are you here? Richard's patience was clearly fraying. Victoria pulled an envelope from her designer purse and set it on the counter with theatrical precision. I'm here because I made a mistake 3 years ago. I left because I thought you'd never change, never prioritize anything over your company. But I've been watching, Richard. I've seen the news coverage of your heroic rescue during the flood. I've seen you playing house with a waitress and her children. And I realized something. She stepped closer to Richard, her voice dropping to an intimate register that made Charlotte want to leave the room but forced herself to stay. You're capable of change. You're capable of being the man I always knew you could be. So I'm here to give us another chance. Victoria, Richard started, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand. Before you answer, you should know something. I'm pregnant. The words detonated like a bomb in the suddenly airless penthouse. Charlotte actually took a step backward, her brain refusing to process the implications. Richard looked like he'd been physically struck. That's not possible, he said hoarsely. We haven't been together in 3 years. Not mine, Victoria clarified with a small, calculated smile. My fiancé's. Well, ex-fiancé now. I left him 2 weeks ago when I realized I was carrying his child and couldn't imagine raising a baby with anyone except you. She moved closer to Richard, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I know it's complicated, but think about it, Richard. You've always wanted a family. Now you can have one. With me. With a woman from your own world, not some charity case you rescued from a flood. Charlotte's vision went red. Before her rational brain could intervene, she was moving, crossing the kitchen to stand directly in front of Victoria with barely controlled fury. Get out, Charlotte said quietly. Get out of this home right now. Victoria laughed, a brittle sound. Excuse me, I don't take orders from the help. I'm not the help, Charlotte said, her voice deadly calm despite the rage vibrating through every cell. I'm the woman raising 4 daughters in this home. I'm the household manager Richard employs. And I'm telling you that you're not welcome here. Richard? Victoria appealed to him, her voice taking on a wounded tone. Are you going to let her talk to me like this? Richard was staring at Charlotte like he'd never seen her before, something fierce and proud blazing in his eyes. Victoria, Charlotte is right, you need to leave. You can't be serious, Victoria said, her composure finally cracking. You're choosing her over me? Choosing a waitress with baggage over a woman from your own social circle? Over a chance at a real family? I have a real family, Richard said quietly, and Charlotte's heart stopped. Maybe not traditional, maybe not what anyone expected, but real. And you don't get to come into their home and insult them. Victoria's face hardened. Fine. But when you get tired of playing house, when the novelty wears off and you remember who you really are, don't come looking for me. I'm offering you legitimacy, Richard. A chance to have children the right way with the right person. Turn that down and you'll regret it. She swept toward the elevator with dramatic flair, then paused at the threshold. Oh, and Charlotte, check the gossip sites. There's already speculation about Richard Hastings' mysterious new family. The media is going to eat you alive when they dig into your background. Single mother, working class, 4 children from a dead husband. They'll paint you as a gold digger who trapped a lonely billionaire. Can you handle that? Can your daughters handle being in the spotlight? The elevator doors closed on Victoria's satisfied smile, leaving behind silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Charlotte stood frozen, Victoria's words echoing in her mind. The media. Public scrutiny. Her daughters exposed to gossip and judgment and… Don't, Richard said, crossing to her. Don't let her get in your head. That's what she does. Finds vulnerabilities and exploits them. She's right, though, Charlotte whispered. The media will destroy us. They'll say I'm using you. They'll say terrible things about my daughters. Violet will hear it. The triplets will grow up with people thinking their mother is a… She couldn't finish the sentence. The media will say whatever sells papers, Richard said firmly. But the people who matter, the people in this penthouse, we know the truth. And I don't care what anyone else thinks. You should care, Charlotte said desperately. Your company, Your reputation, mean nothing compared to what I've found here. Richard interrupted. Charlotte, look at me. She did reluctantly and found his gray eyes burning with intensity. 14 days ago, you and your daughters came into my life by accident. You've spent every moment since then trying to maintain distance, trying to keep boundaries, trying not to need me. But I need you. The confession seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Charlotte. I need the sound of the triplets laughing in the morning. I need Violet's terrible jokes at breakfast. I need the chaos and the mess and the constant noise. I need to be needed, Charlotte. And yes, I need you specifically in ways that terrify me, in ways I'm not brave enough to say out loud yet. Charlotte's breath caught. Richard, I'm not asking you to make promises, Richard continued. I'm not asking you to define what this is or where it's going. I'm just asking you not to leave because Victoria tried to poison something good. Before Charlotte could respond, small feet thundered down the hallway. Violet burst into the kitchen, her face blotchy with tears, the triplets crawling frantically behind her. Is she gone? Violet demanded. That mean lady who said bad things? Is she gone forever? She's gone, Richard confirmed, kneeling down to Violet's level. And she's not coming back. Good, Violet said fiercely, because you're our Richard dad and she can't have you. Richard froze. You're what? Violet's eyes widened, realizing what she'd said out loud. I call you that sometimes, in my head. Because you're like a dad, but you're Richard too, and I didn't know if I was allowed to call you just dad, so I thought Richard dad was okay, but maybe it's not okay, and Richard pulled her into his arms, cutting off her anxious rambling. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Violet, you can call me whatever feels right to you. Richard dad is perfect. Just Richard is perfect. Or just dad if you want. I'd be honored either way. Violet pulled back, studying his face seriously. Can I think about it? Calling someone dad is really important. Mama says it's not just a word, it's a promise. It is a promise, Richard agreed. And I'm promising you right now, Violet Monroe, I'm not going anywhere. No matter what anyone says, no matter what happens, I'm here for as long as you and your sisters and your mama want me. Charlotte's vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for 2 years, for 14 days, for the last impossible hour. She watched Richard with her daughter, watched the triplets crawling to him like he was home base, watched her carefully constructed walls crack and crumble. 3 months, she said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. Our agreement was 3 months. But I don't think I can make it 3 months, Richard. His face fell. Charlotte, if you need to leave sooner, I understand. No, Charlotte interrupted. And now she was crying, really crying, letting it all out. I mean, I can't pretend for 3 months that this is just employment. I can't pretend you're just my boss. I can't pretend my daughters aren't falling in love with you, and I can't. Her voice broke. I can't pretend I'm not falling in love with you too. The confession hung in the air, terrifying and perfect. Richard stood slowly, settling Violet gently aside, stepping toward Charlotte like he was approaching something precious and breakable. Say that again. I'm falling in love with you, Charlotte whispered. And it's terrifying because I barely know you and it's too soon and it's crazy and… Richard kissed her. Not dramatically, not passionately like in movies, but gently, carefully, like she was the most valuable thing he'd ever touched. Charlotte's hands came up to frame his face, feeling his beard beneath her palms, tasting tears, his or hers, she couldn't tell. When they pulled apart, Violet was watching with wide eyes and a growing smile. Does this mean Richard Dad is staying forever? If your mama will have me, Richard said, not looking away from Charlotte. If she's brave enough to ignore what people will say and what society will think and just trust that this impossible, crazy, completely unplanned thing between us is real. Charlotte looked around the penthouse that had become a home, at her daughters who were safe and fed and loved, at this man who'd answered a desperate call and changed everything. She thought about Victoria's warnings, about media scrutiny, about all the rational reasons to walk away. Then she thought about Violet's voice on that phone call saying "Daddy" to a stranger who'd come anyway. She thought about second chances and impossible miracles and love that didn't make sense on paper, but felt absolutely right in her heart. 3 months was always too short, Charlotte said finally. How about forever instead? Forever works, Richard agreed, pulling her close again. Forever works perfectly. Violet cheered. The triplets, not understanding but sensing the joy, clapped their tiny hands. And in the penthouse 42 floors above Manhattan, a family that had been born from floodwater and fear and a child's desperate phone call became permanent. There would be challenges ahead. Media attention, public scrutiny, legal paperwork to formalize what they all already knew. There would be Victoria's venomous attempts to undermine them, which Richard's lawyers would eventually handle with quiet efficiency. There would be Violet's teacher asking about her new father, and Charlotte having to explain their unconventional story. There would be the triplets' first steps, first words, first everything, with Richard there to witness them all. But in that moment, with sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and 5 hearts beating in synchronization, none of the future mattered. They had each other. They had survived a flood and found family in its aftermath. And sometimes, just sometimes, the story the world calls impossible is the one that's most worth living. 6 months later, Richard would officially adopt all 4 girls with Charlotte's blessing. 1 year later, they would get married in a small ceremony with only people who actually mattered. 2 years later, Charlotte would graduate from community college with a degree in social work, determined to help other single mothers who were drowning like she once had been. But the best moment of all would come 7 years after that flood, on Violet's 14th birthday, when she would stand up at her party and tell the story of how she'd saved her sisters with a refrigerator and called a wrong number that turned out to be exactly right. "I called him Daddy that night," Violet would say, older now but still fearless, "because I was scared and I needed someone to save us. And he did. He came into the flood and he never left. That's what real dads do. They show up, they stay, and they keep their promises." Richard, sitting beside Charlotte with the now 7-year-old triplets climbing on his lap, would wipe tears from his eyes and mouth the words he'd said 1,000 times since that fateful night. "Thank you for calling me Daddy, Violet. Thank you for giving me a family to save." And Charlotte, watching her daughters with the man who'd become their father, not by blood but by choice, would whisper back, "Thank you for answering." Because in the end, that's all any of them had done. Answered a call for help. And in answering, they'd all been saved.